Hello, welcome to another Q&A live on White Davy Garden and Worm Farm. Hi Cece, how are you? So today we are going to be looking at 10 reasons why worms try to escape from your worm bin. Some of them you may already know, you may know all of them. Some of them you may already know. So let's look at some of these reasons. Now, there are many reasons why worms try to escape the bins, and especially if you are a beginner worm farmer. Oh, hi, Chanel. If you're a beginner worm farmer, then you will find that it's more likely for your worms to try to escape. So, I'm going to be sharing these 10 reasons with you, and hopefully, that will be able to help you to keep your worms settled and happy in your worm bin. And of course, for those of you who have a worm bin and have experienced your worms trying to leave, it would be awesome if you can share your experiences as well and what you do to keep the worms from escaping from your bin. Now, sometimes it is said that if you cover your bins, then that will prevent the worms from coming out. But as long as there's any form of holes in your bin, or if you have mesh over your bin, that will not be enough to keep your worms in. So let's get into discussing why these worms try to escape. Just a minute, please. I'm on my tablet today because my laptop camera decides to start flashing as I start preparing for the live. Yes, so the first thing is a new environment. So if you're just starting your worm bin, you might notice that for the first few days or the first few weeks, the worms might try to escape. Sometimes it takes 3 weeks for your worms to settle down. Sometimes they will settle down like right away. Yes, but sometimes it takes up to 3 weeks for worms to settle in a new environment. So, what can we do to help our worms to settle down if we have them in a new environment? And we can put light over the bin. Hi, Grow in My Home. How are you? Hi, Helpy. Yes, so you can put light over the worm bin, but what you want to do is to make sure that you don't have the light too close to the worm bin, and especially if the light is one that produces a lot of heat, then you don't want to have it too close to the worm bin. The next thing is when you have light over the worm bin, you have to pay close attention to the worm bin because light will actually dry out the worm skin and it will actually paralyze the worm. If you have it over them and it's close to them for 1 hour, it can actually paralyze them, and if it is there for too long, it can actually kill them. So if you're using light, make sure you keep it a good distance from the worm and make sure that you check on the worms regularly to ensure that they are okay. Now, the next thing that you can do is to keep them covered in a dark environment. That will kind of help them to settle down faster. Let's see, I saw a comment just now. Okay. Right, so keeping them covered will help them to settle down faster too. Another thing that you can do to help them to settle, oh hi mom, is to inoculate the bin before you actually put the worms in. Because once you inoculate the bin, then it has a more friendly environment for the worms, so it is easier for them to settle down. Now, when you get your supply of worms, you usually don't just get worms, they usually come in some form of bedding or other material. So when you are going to be putting them, when you're going to put them in the new bin, you want to ensure that you keep them in that material that you got them in, because by doing that, they will be in somewhat of a familiar environment. So it's not like it's all new to them. So keeping them in that material is a very good way of helping them to settle down. Now, some worms will actually settle down as soon as you put them in the bin. Um, I don't know what it is, why sometimes they will just settle down right away, while other worms, they will just be all over the place. But then when you think about, for example, the fact that the worms can be coming from maybe a different country, maybe they're coming from somewhere with a different climatic condition, even if it is the same country, even if it is the same province or state. So they're coming from one environment to another, so it will take a while for them to acclimatize to the changes. But be patient with them, they will settle down. Now, the next reason why worms will try to leave your bin is if there is too much moisture in your bin. And this is one that even experienced worm farmers sometimes will have issues with this. I know I've had that issue last week with one of my experimental bin, because I was just dampening the surface of the bin. I was attempting to leave them alone for as much as possible. So I wasn't really looking at what's underneath the bottom or the lower portion of the bin. So I didn't notice that the bottom was soaking wet while the top was very dry. So too much moisture can be a problem for your worms. Now, when you are, whether you're starting a worm bin or you have a worm bin that is fully operational, you want to make sure that the amount of moisture that is in your bin is about 80%. Now, a lot of us may not have a moisture meter, so we can't test with a meter whether or not it is 80%. But what we can do is take a portion of the material that is in the worm bin and squeeze it. Now, you want to be careful to what extent you squeeze it if you have worms in that material that you have in your hands, because you don't want to harm your worms. Now, when you squeeze that, you can see one or two drops come out, and that's fine. But if you see water running out, then you know that your worm bin is just too wet. If that is the case, then you can add some form of absorbent bedding to the worm bin. Now, not all bedding have the same level of some bedding are more absorbent than others. So when you are trying to control the amount of moisture in your bin, you want to make sure that you're using the bedding that is very absorbent. An example of this is a comparison between shredded paper and dried leaves. Dried leaves are not very absorbent initially, while shredded paper is. So you want to use shredded paper as opposed to dry leaves. So that's just one example. So you can use that to help to dry out your bin. So the more absorbent the bedding is, then the better it is at controlling the amount of moisture in your bin. Now, there are some who, when they are wetting down their worm bin, they will soak it thoroughly and then allow it to drain off so that they can get the leash yet to use. I don't do that. I'm not saying that there is something wrong with doing that, but that tends to keep your bin on the wetter side than on the drier side. So that method I don't really practice, because I don't want my bin to be too wet. And then I don't want my castings to be muddy as well. And sometimes when you have too much moisture, even though the water is draining out, it can make your castings muddy. And for some reason, I just don't like my castings being all muddy. It's hard to look after when it is like that. Let's see. Okay, and says she never pour water in her worm bin. Okay, so it is good to use a sprayer rather than dumping a lot of water in your bin. So if you have a sprayer, then that is awesome. Now, sometimes, depending on what we're feeding our worms and how much of it we are putting in the worm bin at a time, That can create a lot of moisture in our worm bin as well. So if you're feeding a lot of food scraps that contain a lot of moisture, sometimes it is necessary not to add moisture to the bin because the food scraps can produce enough moisture depending on how much food scraps you are adding. Now, you have to keep in mind that some food scraps contain a lot more water than others. So use that as your judgment when you are feeding your worms to know how much water you may or may not need to add. Okay, Growing My Honey saying hi to Helpy. Yes, so it is very important to control the moisture in your worm bin, but having too much moisture is a problem. Having too little moisture is also a problem because worms breathe through their skin and the water helps them to breathe through their skin. But you don't want the bin to be so wet that it fills the air pockets in the worm bin and then the air cannot get into the worm bin. And you don't want it to be so dry that your worms are not able to breathe either. So you have to try to find the balance. So, like I said before, 80% moisture content is pretty good. That is ideal for the worms. It can be a bit more, it can be a bit less, but trying to keep it around that 80%, which is you can measure with a moisture meter or by squeezing it and see just a few drops coming out of it. Now, your castings or the material in your worm bin should be moist enough where when you squeeze it together, it can form a clump, but as you just do like this, it crumbles easily. If when you do like this with the clump that you have, it does not crumble easily, then you know for a fact that you have way too much moisture in that bin. Now, the third reason why worms may try to escape your bin is because your bin may be too acidic. And overfeeding can make your bins acidic because if you have so much food in the bin that the worms can't keep up with what is there, the food is actually going to go sour, and as it gets sour, it's going to become acidic. Now, feeding your worms too much acidic food, that too can make your bin acidic. Now, it is recommended that you don't feed your worms acidic foods because worms just cannot tolerate acid, but they do eat it, but they will eat it at a much slower pace than they would eat other types of food. So if you're feeding acidic food, make sure that compared to the other types of food scraps that you are feeding the worms, the acidic food is at bare minimum. Now, if you find that your bin starts to smell or your bin is getting acidic, what you can do is add some form of calcium carbonate to the worm bin. So that might include things like crushed oyster shell, crushed eggshell, um, garden lime, and it's good to do some research on the type of garden lime that you're getting because some lime may contain chemicals in them. So you want to make sure that you get one that does not have any chemicals. You can use diatomaceous earth as well. Now the fourth reason why, before I go on to the fourth reason, if it is the case where your bin is becoming acidic because of overfeeding, another way that you can help to solve that problem is by removing some of the extra food. Sometimes it is the case where that is not possible because maybe the worms have permeated throughout the food that you have in the bin. But where possible, try to remove some of the extra food. Or if it is not possible, then stop feeding the worm bin for a while and allow the worms to eat off the food that is there before you add any more food to the bin. Yes, so the fourth reason is lack of oxygen in the bin. Worms do breathe and they breathe through their skin. So you want to ensure that the bin is getting enough air. Now, if you're using a shallow bin, then you don't necessarily have to have holes in your bin, unless, of course, the shallow bin that you're using has a tight lid, then you will need holes in it. If you are using a deep bin, however, you definitely will need to have holes in that bin, and depending on how deep that bin is too, will determine how many holes, size of the holes, and where on the bin you're going to have your holes. So we usually try to put the holes in the bin close to the top of the bin, and then the cover of the bins will have holes in them. But if you are using, say for example, a 55-gallon container, or maybe you're using a 20-gallon container that is long rather than, that is deep rather than long, then that you're going to need to put holes further down on the bin to ensure that there is enough airflow going through that bin. You want to make sure that your worms have enough air at all times. Now, one other thing that you can do to make sure that your worms have sufficient air is to aerate the content of your bin from time to time. You don't want to do that every single time that you go into your worm bin, unless, of course, you look after your worm bin, say every 2 weeks or longer than that. But if you are looking after your worms twice a week, you don't necessarily want to be aerating them that often because they don't like to be disturbed. So once a week or once every 2 weeks is fine. You go through and you turn up the content of the bin, bring up what is on the bottom to the top. If, however, you're using a flow through system where the material is going to, the casting is going to be settling on the bottom, then you just want to aerate just the portion of the material that has the bedding on the food scraps. You don't necessarily want to be mixing in the castings that is already finished with the content that the worms are feeding on. So aerating your bin is very important, and it also serves one other purpose too when you go through the bin and mix the content, because especially if you find that your bin is too wet, sometimes a lot of worm farmers will find that their castings tend to be clumpy. It gets hard like a rock, and then nothing that you do can actually undo that. Once it becomes rock hard, there's nothing you can do more than throw it out. So when your bin is too wet and it is not properly aerated and it is clumpy, if you don't go through and try to refine the material occasionally, then it's going to dry into that clump, and then all of that would be for nothing. So it's good to go into your bin from time to time and just ruffle up the material and loosen up wherever you see they're clumping together, because you don't really want to spend all that time feeding your worms and looking forward to your castings and then you end up losing it, right? Yes, that would be a rather painful experience. Now, the fifth reason why worms will try to escape your bin is because the bin is either too hot or too cold. So each type of worms have their ideal temperature, and so you want to ensure that you know the type of worms that you're raising and you know the ideal temperature for them. Now, sometimes depending on where you're living, it is not easy to maintain the ideal temperature, but if you can keep it a little bit lower or a little bit higher than the ideal temperature, that is fine. But you don't want it to go to the point where the temperature is too hot for them or too cold for them. So when you're getting worms, or if you're raising worms, it's a good idea to know the range that your worms can survive in and the worms that are ideal for them, because there's a difference between the two. So for example, your worms can survive at -10 red wigglers, but that's not necessarily ideal for them, because at that stage it is on the cooler side for them, and that is 10 degrees Celsius, of course. It can be too cool for them.